The reason they don't like Russia is because after the Soviet Union fell, Russia's economy was a mess. It was in shambles, right? It was just a disaster. All of a sudden they had mass unemployment, mass hunger. Capitalism, as we're told, it always leads to making everyone happy and all that. But for some reason, when the Soviet Union fell and they adopted free market capitalism, it led to a complete and total disaster in the country. I mean, their economy just shut down. They had to start buying all their food from the USA because their farm system, shut down. It was a nightmare. It was a humanitarian crisis. Like their top population actually decreased by like 10% during that time. People dying, people committing suicide, people, using opioids, people fleeing and just moving to other countries. I mean, their population went down by 10% during those years. It was a nightmare, right? The USA was meddling to get Boris Yeltsin reelected. And, the 1996 elections were very much, they bragged about how Bill Clinton worked very hard to make sure Boris Yeltsin won the elections. But anyhow, the economy was a disaster. And then Putin came along, and Putin had written his academic thesis as a college student about how Russia's economy could be reorganized around selling oil and gas, right? That they have a lot of oil, they have a lot of gas. And if they made two giant an oil company and a natural gas company, two giant state-controlled energy companies, they could use that and use the money from that to like reboot the rest of the economy. And he wrote this as his PhD thesis when he was in college. And, he was this guy who was in the security services there, and, he got elected and he did it, right? And he fixed Russia's economy dramatically. I mean, 1999, he gets in there. By about 2003, 2004, all of a sudden, Russia's back. Their economy is doing better. Why? Because he has these two giant state-controlled energy companies that are selling oil and gas everywhere. And Bush attacked Iraq and put sanctions on Iran, drove the oil prices up higher than they ever could be, highest oil prices in history. And as a result of that, Russia was back and their economy did better. Well, now Russia's no longer, just a beaten down, destroyed country like it was in the 90s. Now it's a competitor with ExxonMobil and BP and Shell and Chevron. And that's why they don't like Russia. Every ounce of oil and gas the Russians sell is an ounce of oil and gas somebody didn't buy from us. And it's pure, it's an economic competition. That's why the USA was determined to kill the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, right? Russia and Germany. Look at a map. How close is Germany to the United States? How close is Germany to Russia, right? Just kind of common sense. If you need natural gas in Germany, you're going to import it from Russia, not from all the way across the ocean in the United States. Well, Germany and Russia, they built this natural gas pipeline called Nord Stream 2. And, Obama was screaming about it. He didn't like it. Trump was angry about it. He put sanctions on it. They did everything they could to stop this. Well, why? The Germans can buy natural gas from whoever they want. The Russians can sell natural gas. How's it our business at all? Well, the USA tried its hardest. It put sanctions on German government officials. It put sanctions on Russian officials. Well, it's going through. It happened. Like the Germans are now buying natural gas from Russia. The Nord Stream 2 pipeline is finished. And the USA is furious about it, but they don't like a competitor, right? Back when China was the sick man of Asia, one of the poorest countries in the world, the USA didn't have an issue with them. But now that China is the leading producer of steel, half the steel in the world is made in China. They have the top telecommunications manufacturer, cell phone manufacturer, Huawei Technologies. They've lifted their people up out of poverty with a largely state-run economy. The economy is kind of you have a lot of corporations and private companies, but you have a 5-year plan, and you have the Communist Party like basically forcing companies to do what's in the interest of the country's long-term economic growth. Now we see China as our enemy and our competitor. This is what it really gets down to, right? The rulers of the United States are like mafia gangsters, basically. And the world is their corner. The world is their territory, right? And they get to sell the world oil and gas. They get to sell the world steel. They get to sell the world cell phones, and you don't. And if a country breaks out of that and says, hey, we're going to start selling our own products, we're going to raise our people up out of poverty. We're not going to be a poor, dependent, vassal client state. We're actually going to, organize our economy and raise people up. That's when we have a war with them. Lenin called this system, this is a system. This is a global system called imperialism. Lenin called it imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, the rule of monopoly corporations. And that's what imperialism is. And that's the way the US operates around the world. And for a while, especially like in the 50s, you could argue that average Americans benefited from imperialism, right? Because we were beating down Vietnam, beating down Korea, having coups in Latin America. And average Americans, we got cars and TV sets and refrigerators, and we had a high standard of living. But now, in this high-tech economy where they've got 3D printers and artificial intelligence, they don't need a well-paid middle class in the homeland anymore. And what they've been doing to Africa and Asia and Latin America for centuries, they're now starting to do to Pennsylvania and Texas and Oklahoma and Nevada and Ohio. They're driving down the living standards, right? And, you know, when Trump talks about globalists and all of that, like, he's wrong, I guess, but he's pointing to something true, which is that these corporations, you know, ExxonMobil, BP, Bank of America, Chase, they don't have any loyalty to this country. They are part of a global international system. They're raking in profits from all over the world. And as far as they're concerned, America is just New York City and Southern California and Silicon Valley, right? And the rest of the country, they don't care about, right? They see the USA as a couple trading hubs, a couple metropolises in a global system of free trade where the whole world is getting poorer and they're the global middleman. Right? That's how they see it. And there's a lot of Americans who don't want that. They want to see their living standards go up. They want jobs and education. They want a decent life. They want the American dream. And now is the time for solidarity. We got to understand that the same people that are trying to destroy China are trying to destroy our neighborhoods. We have a common interest with these people around the world that are struggling against imperialism, right? We have a common interest and a common destiny. And that's largely the perspective I try to put out, a 21st century socialist, anti-imperialist perspective. That's my view. Capitalism in our age is imperialism, and resisting imperialism is to the benefit of average Americans.
Yeah, absolutely. That was amazingly well said. Absolutely. Yeah. So when we think about imperialism, we tend to think about, you know, like kings and queens and like going back, you know, just the perception of these things. You know, we tend to think, you know, that, you know, we tend to think of those things. And when we think of Americans and we think of, you know, American, you know, we don't think of it as imperialism, obviously, in the mainstream. We think of it as, I don't know, sovereignty or protectoratism or something with a lot more honor in it, obviously. We tend to think of like, well, you know, the revolution to, you know, a monarchy system, the revolution, you know, democracy emerged because, you know, against the systems of monarchy, right? In the form of capitalism, right? That's the argument that you know, capitalism is, and the free market, it means freedom politically as well, right? Like that's sort of the lie that we've been sold. And you know, we're at a point now where, you know, that I feel like I lost my train of thought though. I'm so sorry.
I can jump in and you know, one thing we talk about, you know, the British Empire and the American Revolution. The American Revolution, it had many sides to it, but a big part of it was the struggle against imperialism, was that the British, right? The British Empire was basically telling us that the United States couldn't develop economically. We just had to be kind of a trading hub in the global free trade system. And Adam Smith was new in Britain, and he wrote his book, The Wealth of Nations. And basically, they were telling us in the United States, we couldn't develop our own industries. We couldn't have our own economy. We couldn't have our own markets. We had to be just kind of a captive market for the British. And there were a lot of Americans like Alexander Hamilton, like George Washington and others who said, no, we want to develop the economy of the United States. And that was the basis of the disagreement. Now, unfortunately, developing the economy of the United States meant killing all the Native Americans and expanding westward and having slavery. So obviously that part we don't agree with. But the idea that you know, the economy of the USA should flourish and that we shouldn't just be a temporary holdout, just an outpost in their global, you know, in this global free trade system. That was a big part of it, and that's what we can get behind. And I like Alexander Hamilton a lot. You know, he was against slavery. He wanted to recognize and do business with the Haitians when the Haitian people, the Haitian slaves broke their chains and overthrew the French and started having the first, you know, free slave government, you know, that they established in Haiti. He wanted to do business with them. And his model of economics was this idea that you know, the government should spend money on things like lighthouses. The government should stimulate, you know, and pay for providing education and such, and that the state kind of has an obligation to make sure that the wealth and living standards of the population is increasing. Thomas Jefferson, on the other hand, he was a free market kind of guy. He said, well, we're going to have a nation of yeomen, of small farmers who just do their own thing, and they'll be left alone. And that's silly, because eventually there's going to be a drought, and some farms are going to go out of business, and some are going to stay in business, and eventually you're going to have huge farms and yeomen that are working for big farmers. That doesn't work, right? This, every a nation of small farmers. The economic theories of Thomas Jefferson are largely bunk. But Alexander Hamilton's conception that the state should kind of the economy. Yeah.
Alexander Hamilton. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, the notion that the state should direct the economy to some degree or other to make sure people's lives are getting better, that was a big part of the American Revolution. And I think that's part of the American Revolution we can embrace, right? That idea that the state does have an obligation to improve people's lives, and that we've gotten away from that. You listen to the government now, oh, you're on your own. Like we talked about at the beginning, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. That's not what Alexander Hamilton was about. That's not what the American Revolution was about. The American Revolution was largely saying, no, our government should be working to raise living standards.
Yeah. Well, but it's important also to note that, they were raising living standards off the back of, the underclass, right?
Yes. So, and that's not good, obviously.
Yeah, no, but that's important because that's part of the myth, right? Like that's where I was going. Like that's part of the myth that we were sold, right? With that sort of, capitalism and, like these figures like Carnegie and whatever, like they were not aristocracy, right? They were new money, right? That was a huge thing in the early 1900s is new money. And people were people who had, European aristocracy backgrounds were, snide about those people, but needed them because they ran out of money themselves. Right. So, we were sold this idea essentially that we could identify with those kinds of capitalists, right? That because they were not aristocracy, we were, they were sort of the everyman, and they had been able to rise through through a meritocracy, right? Like they, again, going back to Thomas Frank, he talks a lot about the meritocracy. And I think that we have to recognize that, capitalism and that revolution brought us a new aristocracy, an aristocracy of industry, right? I mean, now we have the Hiltons and the Kardashians and people who are uber rich from, these capitalist systems, these corporations. Right. So, and we follow them in the same way that, peasants of the medieval times would follow like the goings on of the court and the, or maybe not even medieval, more like Renaissance because of the printing press and stuff. So, I mean, that kind of stuff was, sensational at the time, and they read about it in the papers and they love to talk about it and stuff like that. So, we are doing the same thing with celebrities, with with the hyper rich, Bill Gates, these kind of people. And, it's, we need to recognize that we're living in an oligarchy in the same way, right? In an oligarchy, in an aristocracy. I think we should call it that. I think we should call it that for sure.
Yeah, well, it's funny because, we hear this all the time about Andrew Carnegie and all of them. It's like, the rich people of the world, they all just worked so hard to get what they have. And socialism is theft. We just want to take what these people have worked so hard for. Bullshit.
Right.
Capitalism began with mass theft. Look at, and I'm talking about, the theft of the Americas from the Native Americans, talking about colonialism in Africa, the slave trade, but beyond that, even in Europe, right? I mean, it's funny. Why you ever listen to bluegrass music? There's a lot of songs about Charlie, over the river to feed my sheep, over the river. Who's that? That's Bonnie Prince Charlie. Because in Scotland, the Scottish Highlanders rose up against the English. Then after they were defeated, there was a mass genocide in Scotland where they cleared all the commons and they just drove all these people off their land, and a lot of them fled to the United States. That's why there's so many Southerners and West Virginians that have Scottish last names and all of that, because they were robbed of their land. As British and capitalism was emerging, they threw thousands of people off their land. Read about the clearing of the commons, that went on, right? All over Europe. And when they would move toward capitalism, they would rip apart the feudal estates. These peasants had lived on this land for thousands of years, and they were, you know, basically semi-slaves and peasants. They didn't have any rights, but they at least had a place to stay. All of a sudden, the capitalist comes in and says, well, this land's my property. Unless you pay me rent, you're done, right? King Henry VIII had mass executions of homeless people, right? And you wouldn't hear about this, but if you were a vagrant, or the crime of vagrancy or vagabondage, if you were a vagabond, on your third offense, they would hang you. And he executed tens of thousands of people just for being homeless, because all across England, he was going around tearing apart the estates, turning them into private property, creating capitalism, signing them over to some capitalist, and people would have no place to go, and then they would get executed. So, you know, capitalism began with mass genocide. I mean, mass genocide in Europe first, and then genocide in the Americas, and then genocide in Africa, and this notion that they all just worked so hard. I mean, look, how is the land handed out?
Yeah. Go on. Hear that instance, that Henry with the eighth instance.
Yeah.
Let's compare that to what's going on today, right? I mean, because literally, you just described the situation with, you know, banks repossessing houses in BlackRock, right? And like the idea that yeah, oh my God, as you were describing that situation, I was just like, this is literally happening right now. Yeah. I mean, this is, yeah, I mean,
called primitive accumulation. I mean, this is what Karl Marx wrote about. This is what Karl Marx called the rosy dawn of capitalism, right? It was not about free trade and some people just worked hard and got ahead. Nope. Look, the land of the United States, right, was stolen from the Native Americans, but how did they divvy it up? Was it just a fair process where they just, oh, who wants some land? Oh, you want it? Okay, I guess it's your turn to get some. Of course not. The railroad monopolies and the big oil companies, they scooped it up and they got it all. And I mean, it's always been, capitalism has always been a system of mass theft. And it always has been. So this libertarian myth that socialism is theft, no, I mean, no, capitalism is theft. Socialism is the creators of the wealth, the working people. Black, white, Asian, Arab, you know, the working people of this country and of the world, taking back what their labor has created. That's what socialism is. Socialism is ending the theft and putting the people back in control of the wealth that they themselves have created.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's not pretend that the government didn't have a hand in you know, essentially wiping out Native Americans, taking their land and then redistributing it to all of these private companies that we now laud as pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, right? I mean, these companies didn't just arrive out of nowhere. They were subsidized by the government. They're, you know, that's what, well, you know, when we talk about like white people having generational wealth, it's because they literally, you know, the government literally stole it from brown people and then gave it to white people as part of the Homestead Act, as part of many programs. Even after World War II, there were many programs for white veterans that there weren't for black veterans. You know, I mean, this is literally an ongoing thing. It's not part of history, it's current. And, you know, we are, yeah.
Right. Yeah. And then socialism, I mean, you know, many Marxists have said socialism is the expropriation of the expropriators, right? The ruling class, they are expropriators. They've stolen everything they have, and we simply want to steal it back. I mean, that's really what socialism is. We want to steal back what's been stolen from us.
Yes, absolutely.